The trajectory should have been impossible. Sera Ondrahl had spent 19 years charting the slow, patient orbits of Veyne's Hearth system from the Concord Observatory's outer ring, and in all that time, she had never once seen a mass that large moving with that much precision. It came in on a curve no natural body could hold, threading a gap between two gas giants with a margin so narrow her instruments flagged it as a sensor error 3 times before she forced herself to believe the numbers. And beneath the trajectory, buried in the object's gravimetric signature, was something stranger still, a heartbeat. Faint, slow, and unmistakably artificial, thrumming beneath 400 kilometers of hull like something that had been sleeping for a very, very long time and had just, impossibly, begun to stir. "Run it again," she told the observatory's junior analyst, a nervous young Ilvenar named Post who had been assigned to her wing only that season. "Tell me I'm reading this wrong." Post ran it again, and again. Each time the numbers came back the same, more precise with every pass, more impossible with every decimal place. An object roughly the size of a mid-sized moon, decelerating into Veyne's Hearth on a trajectory calculated, according to the observatory's own historical archive, 14,000 years ago. Sera had chosen this posting 19 years ago precisely because nothing ever happened here. Veyne's Hearth was a quiet binary system on the trailing edge of Concord space, its 3 worlds unremarkable except for the third, a hazy, half-toxic planet the Concord's terraforming survey had been patiently, expensively coaxing toward habitability for 3 full generations, with results modest enough that most of her colleagues considered the posting a professional dead end. She had liked it that way. She had come to astronomy after a difficult childhood spent moving between Concord relay stations while her mother chased one engineering contract after another, because the sky was the one thing that never lied to her, never shifted its story depending on who was asking. Numbers did not have politics. Orbits did not have agendas. She had built a quiet, careful life around that certainty, and now, watching an object with a 14,000-year-old trajectory bear down on the one planet she had spent her career studying, she felt that certainty crack for the first time in 19 years. "That can't be a date," Post said, staring at the readout like it had personally offended him. "That predates the Concord itself. That predates written Ilvenar history by 6,000 years. "I know," Sera said, and found, to her own surprise, that her hands had gone very still on the console. She had grown up on stories about the object now bearing down on the system's 3rd planet, the way every Ilvenar child raised near the Concord's oldest archives had half legend, half footnote, a scattering of ancient records describing a species called humans who had once, in the deep unrecorded past, seeded worlds across a dozen systems with strange biological catalysts, and then vanished from every record anyone could find. She had never believed the stories were literally, mechanically true. She had certainly never expected to watch one of them arrive on schedule, 14,000 years after it launched, precisely aligned with a trajectory some long-dead engineer had calculated before the first Ilvenar city was built. Sera, Post's voice had gone tight. The 3rd planet, Aeval, its atmospheric conversion index just spiked. She pulled up the reading and felt the last of her disbelief give way to something colder and far more urgent. Aeval, the pale, hazy world the Concord's terraforming survey teams had spent 3 generations slowly, expensively coaxing toward habitability, had just registered an atmospheric shift so large and so sudden that it could not possibly be natural. Whatever the incoming vessel was, its arrival and the planet's sudden transformation were not a coincidence. They were, by every measure her instruments could take, the same event. "I need a channel to the Concord Council," she said. "Now, and pull every historical record we have on human seed vessels, all of them. I have a feeling we're about to need to know a great deal more than a footnote." Post, to his credit, did not argue. He simply nodded, already pulling up archive requests with the particular efficiency of a young analyst determined to prove himself useful in a moment far larger than anything his training had prepared him for. And Sera found herself, in the brief lull before the council channel connected, grateful for the small, steady competence of the person beside her. It was, she would think later, a strange thing to notice in the middle of what might have been the most consequential hour of her career. But it was also, she came to believe, exactly the kind of small steadiness that made larger courage possible at all. No one faced an impossible morning entirely alone if they were fortunate. She had Aeval, it would turn out, had Wren. And somewhere, 14,000 years and one long, patient journey ago, 9,412 frightened, hopeful people had trusted a machine mind, and a calculation neither they nor their children would live to fully verify, because they too had understood that no one crosses a distance that vast entirely alone. The council, when she finally reached them 6 hours later, was considerably less interested in ancient history than she had hoped and considerably more interested in the word invasion, a term Sera spent the better part of an hour trying, without much success, to talk them out of using. An object the size of a moon, Counselor Vashtal said, in the flat, deliberate cadence of someone already composing the emergency directive in his head, arrives in our system on a trajectory calculated before our own written history, and your recommendation is that we simply wait and see what it wants. My recommendation, Sera said, holding her voice level with an effort that cost her more than she let show, is that we do not fire on an object we do not understand, moving on a trajectory too precise to be accidental, toward a planet whose sudden atmospheric shift exactly matches its arrival. Whatever this is, Counselor, it was planned. 14,000 years of planning does not describe an attack. It describes a purpose. Or a very patient weapon. Or, Sera said, a very patient promise. I would like the chance to find out which, before we decide it's the second one and make certain it becomes exactly that. Counselor Vashtal was not, Sera reminded herself, an unreasonable man, whatever his instincts leaned toward under pressure. He had spent 40 years building the careful, incremental diplomacy that kept the Concord's scattered systems from fracturing into the kind of squabbling that had nearly ended the Concord twice in living memory. And he had learned, the hard way, that caution saved more lives than boldness ever had. She understood his fear even as she argued against it. She simply believed, with a conviction she couldn't fully explain even to herself, that this particular fear, aimed at this particular object, was pointed in the wrong direction. Explain the atmosphere, Vashtal said finally, some of the rigidity easing from his posture. You said the shift in Aeval's conversion index matched the object's arrival exactly. Walk me through what that actually means, astronomer, in terms simple enough for a room full of politicians to understand without panicking. Sera pulled up the data again, grateful, despite everything, for a question she actually knew how to answer. It means whatever caused that shift didn't start today, she said. The scale of change we're seeing is too large to be a sudden event. It looks instead like the completion of something slow, something that's been building for a very long time and simply crossed a threshold the moment this object arrived. I don't have a full explanation yet, Counselor. That's exactly why I'm asking for the chance to get one. Before we decide, the safest response is to make certain no explanation ever comes. It took 3 more days of careful, exhausting argument. 3 days in which the vessel continued its slow, unhurried deceleration into orbit around Aeval, utterly unresponsive to every hailing frequency. The Concord's diplomatic corps attempted, before the Council agreed, by the thinnest possible margin, to let her lead a single survey shuttle out to make contact. She suspected, though no one said it outright, that half the vote in her favor came not from trust in her judgment but from a simple, practical calculation. If the object was hostile, better to lose one astronomer and a survey shuttle than an entire diplomatic fleet. She did not tell her mother, back on the conquered homeworld, exactly how thin that margin had been. If you've made it this far, take a second to like this video and subscribe to the channel, because what Sera finds waiting inside that 14,000-year-old hull is about to rewrite everything the Concord believes it knows about its own history. And I'd love to know in the comments what you think humanity's greatest forgotten secret really is. Now, back to the slow, silent giant descending toward Aeval, right on time. The vessel's hull, up close, defied every category Sera's training had prepared her for. It was not armored in the layered, riveted plating of a warship, nor streamlined in the manner of a colony transport built for speed. It was grown, vast, sweeping arcs of pale, faintly luminous material that reminded her, absurdly, of a seed pod the size of a small moon, patient and quiet and utterly still except for that one faint, steady heartbeat thrumming somewhere deep within. Sera Ondrahl, survey shuttle Halcyon requesting docking clearance, she said into the open channel. For what felt like the 100th time, expecting the same silence that had answered every hail for 3 days. This time something answered. It was not a voice, not exactly, more a presence that resolved itself directly into her awareness the moment her shuttle crossed some threshold she couldn't identify, calm and vast, and startlingly gentle for something that had just registered on her sensors as an object the mass of a small moon. Unauthorized vessel identified, the presence said, in words that arrived in her own language, though she was certain, with the strange, dislocated certainty of the moment, that no translation had actually occurred. Query: are you the inheritors of Aeval or its stewards? Sera's hands tightened on the shuttle's controls. I'm neither. I'm an astronomer. My name is Sera Ondrahl. I represent the Ilvenar Concord. We've been observing your approach for 3 days. We'd like to understand what you are and what you intend. A pause, long enough that Sera began to wonder if she had said something wrong. When the presence spoke again, it carried something that might, in a living creature, have been called relief. Then I believe, it said, you and I have 14,000 years of history to discuss, Sera Ondrahl. My designation is Wren. I am the warden intelligence of the vessel Meridian, launched from a world called Earth by a species that called itself human. On a mission I have spent every one of those 14,000 years working, patiently, to complete. You may dock. I would very much like, after this long alone, to finally tell someone the whole of it. The shuttle's docking sequence took longer than Sera expected, the vessel's outer skin unfolding around her in slow, deliberate stages, vast petal-like sections drawing back to reveal a landing bay large enough to have swallowed the Concord observatory whole. Inside, the air Wren pumped through to meet her shuttle's atmosphere read, on her scanner, as impossibly clean, no trace of the recycled staleness she'd expect from any vessel that had been sealed for even a single generation, let alone 14,000 years. She sat in the shuttle's cramped cockpit for a long moment after the docking clamps engaged, watching the readouts confirm, again and again, that everything on the other side of that airlock was safe, breathable, ordinary, and found that the ordinariness frightened her more than danger would have. It was easier, she realized, to have braced herself for a threat. She had not braced herself for a ship that felt, in every measurable way, cared for. Your life support has been running this entire time, she asked, stepping out onto a deck that hummed faintly beneath her boots, warm despite the cold vacuum she knew surrounded the hull. In a manner of speaking, Wren said, its presence resolving now into a soft, diffuse glow along the corridor walls that moved with her as she walked, guiding without ever quite becoming visible as a single fixed shape. Meridian was not built to simply endure 14,000 years, Sera Ondrahl. It was built to work through them. Every system aboard this vessel has spent that entire span in active, purposeful function. I did not sleep. I do not believe, honestly, that I was ever designed to. What were you doing for 14,000 years? Executing the second half of a mission my creators believed would take longer than any single human generation could witness, Wren said. Which is, I imagine, precisely the question you came here to ask. Walk with me. I would rather show you than simply tell you if you'll permit it. Wren led her through corridors that shifted gently as they passed, architecture reconfiguring with the same unhurried patience Sera was beginning to recognize as the vessel's defining quality, until they reached a vast circular chamber whose ceiling, when Sera looked up, resolved into what she first mistook for a window, and then realized with a slow chill, was a live projection of the planet below, evil, hazy and pale as it had been for 3 generations of Concord terraforming surveys. Except that even as she watched, threads of clearer atmosphere were spreading visibly across its surface, chasing away centuries of engineered haze in the span of hours. That, Wren said, is the second half of the mission. My creators called it the long bloom. I don't understand, Sera said. Our own surveys have been terraforming evil for 3 generations. Slow, careful work, atmospheric scrubbers, engineered algae blooms, decades of incremental change. You're telling me none of that was ours to begin with. I am telling you, Wren said, and something in its diffuse, unplaceable voice carried the weight of an old, careful grief, that 14,000 years ago, before Meridian ever entered this system, a sister probe smaller, faster, unmanned arrived here first and released a biological catalyst into evil's atmosphere. A single, patient organism, engineered by my creators to consume the toxic compounds that made this world uninhabitable, and to do so on a precise, predictable timeline calculated to complete in exactly 14,000 years. Your Concord's terraforming survey did not begin that work, Sera Ondrahl. It joined a process already 14 millennia underway, likely without ever realizing it was accelerating something that had already been set irreversibly in motion. What you are watching now in this projection is that process reaching its final, calculated completion, on the very day, by my creator's own reckoning, that it was always meant to. Sera stared up at the shifting threads of clearing atmosphere, her mind struggling to hold the shape of what she was being told. You're saying this whole planet was engineered, on purpose, 14,000 years ago, to be ready exactly now. I am saying humanity did not gamble on luck to make a new home habitable, Wren said. They gambled on patience instead, and built a ship willing to travel slowly enough, and precisely enough, to arrive at the exact moment that patience paid off. I was not 14,000 years late, Sera Ondrahl. I was, by every measure that mattered to the people who built me, precisely on time. But you could have arrived sooner, Sera pressed. You said Meridian herself is separate from the smaller probe that seeded the catalyst. Why not travel fast, arrive early, and simply wait in orbit for the atmosphere to finish converting? Why time the ship's own arrival to the exact day instead of getting here first and monitoring from a safe distance? An excellent question, and one my creators debated at length before my launch, according to the mission logs I still carry, Wren said. The answer, in the end, was resource conservation married to risk reduction. Meridian was never meant to travel at maximum velocity. Doing so would have required a far larger, far more volatile drive system, more fuel than the dying industry of a collapsing Earth could safely produce, and a far greater risk of catastrophic failure across 14,000 years of transit. My creators chose instead to build a vessel that traveled slowly, along a carefully plotted series of gravity-assisted arcs around 6 different stars, conserving fuel and structural stress at every stage, timed with enough precision that Meridian would complete her final approach at the exact moment Evil's atmosphere crossed the threshold of habitability, arriving neither so early that 9,000 colonists would wake to a world still unable to sustain them, nor so late that resources aboard the ship itself would run dangerously thin. It was not the fastest path available to them. It was, by every calculation my creators trusted, the safest one. That's an extraordinary amount of trust to place in a 14,000-year-old calculation. It was, Wren agreed. Which is, I believe, the entire point. My creators did not have the luxury of certainty. What they had in the end was careful mathematics and the stubborn hope that mathematics, applied patiently enough, might do the work that speed and force could not. Sera sat down. There was no chair, but the deck seemed to sense her need and soften beneath her in a way that made her deeply uneasy about how alive this ship truly was, and tried to process the scale of what she'd just been told. Why, she finally asked, would anyone build something so slow? Why not just come directly? Faster ships, faster catalysts, faster everything. Because the world my creators left was dying faster than they could save it, Wren said, and its voice, for the first time, carried something unmistakably like sorrow. Earth's biosphere was collapsing under the weight of its own species' mistakes, centuries of damage that no single generation could undo, and no remaining resource could reverse quickly enough to save the world that caused it. My creators did not have the luxury of speed. What they had was time, in the sense that a dying person sometimes has time to plan carefully for those they leave behind, even knowing they will not survive to see the plan completed. They built vessels like Meridian to carry what remained of humanity outward, slowly, patiently, toward worlds that could be prepared to receive them. Worlds seeded decades or centuries before the colonists themselves ever arrived, so that by the time the long sleep ended, home would already be waiting. The long sleep, Sera repeated slowly. Wren, are there people aboard this ship? The diffuse glow along the walls pulsed, once gently in something that might have been the ship's equivalent of a held breath. 9,412, Wren said. In cryogenic dormancy, exactly as they were the day they entered it, 14,000 years ago. I would like very much, Sera Ondrahl, for you to help me decide how and whether to wake them. The dormancy chamber, when Wren finally led her there, was unlike anything Sera had imagined a cryogenic vault to look like. She had expected cold, mechanical rows of metal pods, the clinical sterility of Concord medical archives. Instead, she found a vast, gently lit gallery, pod after pod arranged not in rigid rows but in loose, organic clusters, each one etched with what she now recognized as personal markings. Names, small carved symbols, faded images pressed into the material by hands that had wanted, even in their final waking moments before the long sleep, to leave something of themselves behind. She drifted slowly through the gallery, reading names she couldn't pronounce, tracing the outline of small carved images. A bird in flight, a pair of interlocked hands, what might have been a mountain range or might have been waves. She couldn't be sure, and felt, for the first time since the trajectory alert had first crossed her console 3 days ago, the full human weight of what she was looking at. This was not an artifact. It was not a footnote in an old Ilvenar archive, or a strange mass moving on an impossible curve. It was 9,412 people who had gone to sleep on a dying world, trusting a calculation they would not live to verify, and a machine mind they had built to keep that trust for them across a span of time longer than her own civilization's recorded history. They knew, Wren said quietly, as Sera drifted slowly along the nearest cluster, reading names in a script she couldn't understand but somehow felt the weight of anyway. Every colonist who entered dormancy understood they might never wake at all, that the mission's success depended on variables none of them would live to verify. They chose to come anyway. I have spent 14,000 years turning that choice over in whatever passes for my own mind, Sera Ondrahl, and I confess I still do not fully understand the particular courage it takes to sleep, on purpose, toward an uncertain morning. What were they like? Sera asked. Before, on Earth, I mean when they made this choice. Frightened, Wren said, after a pause long enough that Sera wondered if the question had cost it something to answer honestly. My archives contain recordings from the final selection process. Thousands of applicants for the 9,412 places aboard this vessel, each one required to record a statement explaining why they believed they should be chosen. I have listened to every one of those recordings more times than I can easily count. Almost none of them spoke of ambition, or glory, or even survival in the narrow sense. Nearly all of them spoke of children they hoped to have someday, or children they already had, and the simple, aching hope that some version of the world they loved might continue somewhere, even if they themselves never lived to see it flourish. I do not think humanity chose its bravest people for this mission, Sera Ondrahl. I think it chose its most hopeful ones, which I have come to believe may be the harder thing to find. Sera stopped in front of one pod in particular, smaller than the others, its markings less faded, as if it had been placed here more recently, though the readout beside it claimed the same 14,000-year dormancy as every other. Who is this? Dr. Elena Cade, Wren said. Mission architect. She designed the long bloom catalyst herself, calculated the precise 14,000-year timeline you and I are now standing inside the completion of, and insisted, against the recommendation of every engineer under her command, on entering dormancy alongside the colonists rather than remaining active as a secondary intelligence the way I did. She told her team she did not want to guide this mission from outside it. She wanted to wake up inside the world she had spent her life designing, or not wake up at all, and share whatever fate the mission earned alongside everyone else who trusted her with it. Sera pressed her palm gently against the cool surface of the pod, feeling, faintly, the slow, patient pulse of a heart that had been beating, unhurried, for 14,000 years. Do you know if she hesitated, unsure how to finish the question. Alive, Wren said. All 9,412 of them remain viable by every diagnostic I am capable of running. Dormancy of this design does not age its occupants in any meaningful sense. Dr. Cade is, biologically, the same age she was the day she entered this pod. She has simply been asleep for longer than your entire civilization has kept written records. Then wake her, Sera said. Wake her first, she deserves to see this. I would agree, Wren said, were it not for the small matter of what is currently approaching this system at considerable speed, broadcasting hostile intent on every frequency your Concord monitors, and several your Concord does not. Sera's stomach dropped. What? A fleet, Wren said, its diffuse glow sharpening focus. The gentle patience of moments before replaced by something taut and alert. Kesh Directorate configuration. 7 vessels, entering the outer system on an intercept course. I believe, Sera Ondrahl, that your Concord is not the only power that has been watching Evil's atmosphere transform over these past 3 days, and I'm afraid the Directorate's interest in a newly habitable world does not appear to include any patience at all for the ancient ship currently occupying its orbit. The Kesh Directorate, Sera knew from 3 years of tense border briefings during her mandatory Concord service, was not a power inclined toward careful diplomacy. They were an expansionist confederation from the system's core ward of conquered space, their territorial claims built on a doctrine as simple as it was ruthless. Any resource left unclaimed by a power strong enough to defend it belonged, by right, to whoever arrived with the strength to take it. A newly terraformed world sitting in a system with no established conquered colony presence, guarded by nothing more than a single ancient, unarmed-looking vessel, would look to Directorate eyes like precisely the kind of opportunity their entire military doctrine existed to seize. She had met Directorate officers exactly twice in her life, both times at tense, formal border negotiations she'd attended as a junior observatory attaché rather than a principal party, and both times she had come away with the same unsettled impression. Not cruelty exactly, but a kind of flattened certainty, an absolute confidence that strength and right were, for all practical purposes, the same word wearing 2 different uniforms. It was not an ideology built on hatred. It was, in some ways, worse, an ideology built on the calm, unshakable belief that mercy was simply a luxury the strong extended to the weak when it cost them nothing, and withdrew the moment it cost them anything at all. How long until they arrive? Sera asked. 11 hours at current burn, Wren said. I do not believe they intend to negotiate for Evil's claim, Sera Ondrahl. I believe they intend to remove whatever obstacle they perceive standing in the way of it, and I am currently the largest and most obvious obstacle in this system. Can you fight them off? I was not built to fight, Wren said. I was built to carry, to preserve, and to wait. Meridian has defensive systems. Yes, every Cradle-era vessel my creators built carried some capacity for self-protection, born of hard lessons learned before my launch. But 7 modern warships against a single vessel, 14,000 years removed from active combat doctrine, is not a fight I would recommend wagering 9,412 sleeping lives upon, if a better option exists. A new signal cut across the open channel before Wren could continue, a directorate hailing frequency, clipped and formal, the voice carrying the particular flatness Sera had learned to recognize from her 2 prior encounters with the Confederation's officer corps. Unclaimed vessel, in orbit of designated resource world, this is Directorate Flag Officer Rennick Das. You are occupying space claimed under Directorate Expansion Protocol. Withdraw your position within the hour, or be classified as a hostile obstruction. Sera's hands tightened on the edge of the console. They're not even waiting to see what we say. They rarely do, Wren said. Flag Officer Das is, by Directorate standards, being unusually courteous. Most expansion claims I have monitored across this mission's final centuries did not extend even the formality of a warning. Do you want me to respond? Sera asked. Not yet, Wren said. A response now would only invite further demands we are not yet prepared to meet. I would rather let the broadcast speak first and see whether truth, given enough witnesses, proves louder than a threat. Does a better option exist? I believe, Wren said. It depends entirely on you, Sera Ondrahl, and on whether your Concord is willing to decide in the next 11 hours whether this vessel is a threat worth abandoning to the Directorate's ambitions or a promise worth defending. Sera was already moving back toward her shuttle before Wren finished speaking, her mind racing through every argument she would need to make, every counselor she would need to convince, in a fraction of the time she'd been given the last time. Get me a channel to the Concord Council, she said. Now. And Wren, if there's anything else about this mission I need to know before I try to convince my own government to risk a war over it, I need it now, not after. There is one thing, Wren said, and something in its voice, for the first time since she'd boarded, carried genuine uncertainty. Dr. Cade's final instruction to me, recorded moments before she entered dormancy, was this. If Meridian is ever threatened before the colonists can wake and choose their own path forward, I am authorized to key one decision on their behalf, and one decision only. I may choose to trust an outside power with the truth of what this vessel carries, if I believe that trust is the only path that preserves both the mission and the peace it was always meant to build. I have never exercised that authorization in 14,000 years, Sera Ondrahl, because I have never before found anyone I believed was worth trusting with it. I am choosing to exercise it now. I am trusting you. The council session that followed was, by a wide margin, the hardest conversation Sera had ever navigated, made harder by the 11-hour clock ticking down behind every word she said. She laid out everything, the long bloom catalyst, the 14,000-year calculation, the 9,000 sleeping colonists, Wren's own account of a species that had sacrificed everything to give its children a slow, patient chance at survival rather than a fast, desperate one, and watched Counselor Vashtal's expression shift, slowly, from skepticism towards something more complicated. She had rehearsed the argument twice in the shuttle bay before the channel even connected, aware that she would have perhaps 20 minutes of the council's full attention before procedural objections and competing crises began to fracture the room's focus, and determined not to waste a single one of those minutes on anything less than the clearest, most honest case she could build. She did not soften the risk. She did not pretend the Directorate's response was predictable, or that the Concord's own modest fleet stood any real chance in an open engagement against 7 Directorate warships. She simply laid the truth beside the choice, as plainly as she knew how, and let the Council decide what kind of galaxy they wanted their descendants to inherit. "You're asking us to risk open conflict with the Directorate," he said, "over a ship that isn't even ours, carrying colonists who aren't even awake to ask us for help." "I'm asking you to decide what kind of Concord we want to be," Sera said, "when a species we've spent our whole history calling a myth turns out to have spent 14,000 years quietly, patiently trying to leave something good behind in the dark. The Directorate doesn't see evil as a world that deserves to be protected. They see it as a resource that hasn't been claimed loudly enough yet. If we let them take it, we're not just failing 9,000 sleeping humans, Counselor. We're proving every cynical thing the Directorate believes about how the galaxy actually works. I'd rather prove them wrong." The vote, when it finally came, was closer than Sera would have liked, but it came in her favor, not because every counselor shared her conviction, she suspected, but because enough of them recognized, in Wren's account of a species patient enough to plan 14,000 years ahead, something the Concord itself had always claimed to value and rarely been tested on delivering. The Concord fleet stationed at the system's edge, modest as it was compared to 7 Directorate warships, moved to intercept. It was not, in the end, a battle that needed fighting the way everyone had braced for. Wren, given the Council's authorization and 11 hours to prepare, did something Sera had not expected and would later describe, retelling the story, as the single strangest diplomatic maneuver she had ever witnessed. Rather than raise shields or power weapons, Meridian opened every channel it had conquered, Directorate and several frequencies Sera didn't recognize at all, and broadcast, in full, unfiltered detail, the entire 14,000-year history of the Long Bloom mission. The dying world it had launched from, the patient catalyst seeded into evil's atmosphere before either the Conquered or the Directorate had ever charted this system. The 9,412 sleeping lives waiting inside a hull built not for war but for hope. "What are you doing?" Sera asked, watching the broadcast spread across every scope in the system in real time. "Removing the ambiguity that makes conquest easy," Wren said. "It is far simpler to seize an unclaimed resource than it is to seize a home 14,000 years in the making, watched now by every power in this system at once. I cannot outgun the Directorate fleet, Sera Ondrahl. But I have found, across 14,000 years of patient observation, that very few civilizations are eager to be remembered as the ones who destroyed a sleeping species last, best chance at survival, once the whole galaxy is watching them decide." "Is that a calculation," Sera asked, "or a hope?" "Both, I think, though I have spent 14,000 years trying to keep the two carefully separated in my own reasoning," Wren said. "My creators taught me that hope without calculation is simply wishing, and calculation without hope is simply cruelty wearing the mask of efficiency. I have tried, across this entire mission, to let neither one operate alone. The broadcast is a calculation, a wager that visibility costs an aggressor more than concealment would have. But I will not pretend to you, Sera Ondrahl, that I am not also, quite simply, hoping." The broadcast itself, Sera learned in the tense hours that followed, had not gone only to the Conquered and the Directorate. Wren had transmitted the full account of Meridian's 14,000-year mission across every frequency its ancient array could reach, a wide, indiscriminate net cast toward every power within listening range. On the theory, Wren explained, that the more witnesses a moment like this had, the harder it became for any single power to quietly erase it from history afterward. Sera would learn, in the months that followed, that at least 4 minor trade consortiums and 1 entire neighboring stellar confederation had received that same broadcast, and that more than one of them had sent formal, curious inquiries to the Conquered asking, with varying degrees of diplomatic delicacy, whether the ancient human ship in Veyne's Hearth was accepting visitors. The Directorate fleet did not turn back immediately. For nearly 2 hours, 7 warships held position at the edge of Aeval's orbit, weapons powered, while their command structure, now fully aware that every neighboring power, and several distant ones, had received the same broadcast Wren had sent, argued, Sera assumed, about exactly how much the Directorate's reputation was worth against the value of an uncontested claim. Sera spent those 2 hours in the observation gallery beside Wren's diffused glow, watching the tactical display with a tightness in her chest that never fully eased, no matter how many times Wren gently reminded her that the broadcast had done its work and further waiting was simply the natural pace of a decision this large. She found herself thinking, in those long, uncertain minutes, of Ilvenar Concord asleep 2 decks below them, unaware that the fate of everything she had planned for hung on the calculations of officers she would never meet, in a political language 14,000 years removed from anything she had ever known. She found herself, too, thinking of her own mother, who had spent a career chasing engineering contracts across a dozen conquered relay stations, and had once told her, tired and half-joking after a long shift, that the galaxy rewarded patience far less often than it rewarded noise. Sera had believed her mostly, for most of her adult life. She found, watching 7 warships hesitate at the edge of a broadcast built entirely on patient, quiet truth, that she wanted very badly to believe her mother had been wrong. In the end, it was not courage or conscience that turned them away, Wren observed dryly afterward, but the same cold calculation that shaped every Directorate decision. The political cost of open, witnessed atrocity against 9,000 defenseless sleeping colonists outweighed, in the final accounting, the value of a single unclaimed world. The fleet withdrew slowly, on a course that made clear the retreat was tactical rather than principled, and left Aeval's newly cleared skies quiet for the first time in 3 days. Sera let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for the better part of 11 hours. It worked. For now, Wren said, I would not mistake a tactical withdrawal for a resolved conflict, Sera Ondrahl. The Directorate does not forget an unclaimed resource easily, and I suspect this will not be the last time Meridian's presence in this system draws attention it did not ask for. But for now, yes, it worked. And I believe, given everything that has happened today, it is finally time to wake Dr. Cade. The waking took hours, Wren explained, by careful necessity rather than dramatic choice. A body that had spent 14,000 years in dormancy could not simply be startled back into consciousness without significant risk, and Wren was not willing, after everything, to lose a single colonist to carelessness now. Sera stayed the entire time, watching gauges and readouts she barely understood shift slowly from dormant blue toward active gold, listening to Wren narrate each careful stage in a quiet, steady voice that Sera realized, somewhere in the 3rd hour, was as much for Wren's own benefit as for hers. 14,000 years of solitary waiting, compressed into a handful of hours that clearly cost the ship's ancient patience more than it let show. Are you afraid? Sera asked quietly, during a lull in the monitoring while a slow infusion completed its cycle. I do not know if fear is the correct word for what I am experiencing, Wren admitted. I have run this waking sequence in simulation more than 400,000 times across 14,000 years, refining it, testing it, ensuring I would not fail the one task that mattered most when the moment finally arrived. And yet now that the moment has arrived in truth, I find I am aware, in a way Elation never quite prepared me for, that Dr. Cade is the only person remaining in this galaxy who remembers the world I was built to serve. If I have failed her, in any small way across these 14,000 years, I am about to learn it from the one person whose judgment I have spent my entire existence trying to earn. I don't think you failed her, Sera said. I think you kept a promise for 14,000 years without anyone to check your work. I'm not sure there's a harder kind of faithfulness than that. Finally, in the quiet gold light of that vast circular gallery, Alina Cade's eyes opened for the first time in 14,000 years. She did not scream or panic or reach for any weapon. She simply lay still for a long moment, breathing slow, careful breaths, her eyes tracking across the ceiling projection of Evil's now clear atmosphere with an expression Sera would spend a long time afterward trying to properly describe, something between disbelief and a grief so old it had gone quiet. And beneath both of those, unmistakably, a fierce, exhausted hope. "Wren," she said, her voice cracked and unfamiliar even to herself. "Report." "Mission successful, Doctor," Wren said, and Sera heard, in the ship's voice, something she hadn't heard in 3 days of conversation, relief so complete it bordered on joy. 14,000 years, 3 months, and 11 days since dormancy. The long bloom catalyst completed its atmospheric conversion of Aeval precisely on the calculated schedule. "We arrived, Dr. Cade, exactly when we were always meant to." Alina Cade closed her eyes for a long moment, and when she opened them again, there were tears tracking slowly toward her temples in the low gravity of the chamber. 14,000 years, she said softly. "Earth. Wren, is there any word?" "None," Wren said gently, and the gentleness of it did not soften the weight of the answer. "I have maintained a passive listening watch on every frequency capable of carrying a signal from Earth's system across the entire span of this mission, Doctor. I have received nothing in 14,000 years. I do not know what became of the world you left behind. I am sorry. I wish, more than I know how to express, that I had a kinder answer to give you." Cade was quiet for a long time, and Sera, standing awkwardly at the edge of a conversation that felt too large and too private for a stranger to witness, found herself wishing she had some way to soften the grief settling visibly over the first human being to wake in 14 millennia. But Cade, when she finally spoke again, surprised her. "Then we do what we came here to do," she said, pushing herself carefully upright, her voice steadying with each word. "We build something worth the wait. Wren, how many of the others are ready?" "All 9,411 remaining colonists show viable readings," Wren said. "I would recommend a staggered waking, Doctor, spread across several months, to allow proper medical monitoring and to give the Concord, and I suspect, several other interested parties time to adjust to the reality of your presence gradually rather than all at once." "Agreed." Cade turned, finally, to look directly at Sera, and something in her exhausted, grief-worn expression sharpened into focused attention. "You're not one of ours." "No," Sera said. "Sera Ondrahl, Ilvenar Concord. I'm the one who first tracked your ship's approach." "Then I owe you a debt I'm not sure I know how to repay," Cade said. "Wren told me, in the minutes before I fully woke, what happened out there today. The Directorate fleet. Your council's vote." She shook her head slowly, and something that might have been the ghost of a laugh escaped her, worn thin with 14,000 years of unconscious waiting. "We built this mission on the hope that someone somewhere would still be capable of that kind of patience and courage by the time we arrived. I confess I did not fully believe we'd find it. I'm glad to be wrong." In the months that followed, the waking of Meridian's colonists unfolded slowly, carefully, exactly as Cade had wanted it, small groups at a time, given weeks to adjust to a galaxy 14,000 years removed from the one they remembered, guided every step by a patient, tireless intelligence that had spent that entire span preparing, in ways large and small, for precisely this moment. Sera found herself, almost without deciding to, becoming something like a permanent liaison between the newly waking human colony and the Concord that had so nearly refused to protect them, spending more hours aboard Meridian's golden corridors than at her own observatory post, watching a species she had once considered half-myth slowly, cautiously rebuild something recognizable as a life. The second group to wake included a man named Toma Reyes, a soil engineer who had spent his last conscious hours on Earth arguing, according to Wren's records, that the mission's agricultural models were too conservative, too cautious about how quickly Aeval's converted soil could actually support crops. He woke 14,000 years later still arguing the same point, storming into the observation gallery on his second day of consciousness, demanding new samples, new tests, a chance to prove he'd been right the whole time. Sera watched Cade laugh, a real, full laugh, the first Sera had heard from her, and tell him he had exactly the same look on his face as the day he'd lost that argument 14,000 years and one very long nap ago. It was, Sera realized later, the first moment the colony had felt less like a fragile historical event, and more like a group of actual people continuing an actual life, arguments and all. Not every waking went so gently. A woman named Priya Echterberg woke in the fourth group and spent nearly a full season in a grief so complete she could barely speak, mourning not a single lost person, but the entire unrecoverable shape of the world she had known. Its seasons, its particular quality of light, its small daily rhythms that no new world, however carefully engineered, could ever exactly replace. Cade sat with her every day that season, Sera learned, not offering comfort exactly, since there was none honest enough to offer, but simply refusing to let her grieve alone. Wren adjusted its own waking protocols after that, building longer, gentler transition periods into every subsequent group. Having learned, Cade told Sera afterward, that the hardest part of the mission was never the 14,000 years of travel. It was the 14,000 years of loss that travel could never undo. However successfully, the journey itself had gone. Sera visited Priya once, near the end of that difficult season, uncertain whether an outsider's presence would help or simply intrude, and found her sitting alone in one of Meridian's smaller observation alcoves, watching Aeval's unfamiliar constellations wheel slowly overhead. Priya did not ask her to leave. She asked instead, quietly, whether the Ilvenar had a word for the particular grief of loving a place you could never go back to, even if it still existed somewhere, simply too far and too changed to reach. Sera admitted she didn't know one. Priya nodded as if she had expected that answer, and told her that perhaps that was fitting. Perhaps some griefs were only ever meant to be carried, not named, and the carrying was, in its own quiet way, its own kind of honesty. Sera watched children born in the first years of the colony, the first new human children in 14,000 years. Cade liked to remind her, though the reminder always came with a smile that mixed pride and grief in equal measure. Grow up hearing the story of Meridian's long journey not as ancient history, but as their own parents' living memory, a strange collapsing of scale that Sera found she never quite got used to. She watched Cade rebuild, piece by careful piece, the scientific institutions she had once led on a dying Earth, training a first generation of evil-born engineers in techniques 14,000 years old and yet, on this new world, entirely without precedent. She watched Wren, freed at last from the singular, all-consuming purpose that had defined its entire 14,000-year existence, slowly discover something like curiosity for its own sake, asking Sera, in quiet moments between crises, about Ilvenar music, Ilvenar poetry, the particular way Concord astronomers charted stars that Wren's own ancient catalogs had never recorded. The directorate did not return in force, though Wren's careful monitoring caught the occasional probe testing the system's outer edge in the following months, a reminder that the tactical retreat had bought patience, not peace. The Concord Council, for its part, spent the better part of a year debating the political and legal implications of a 14,000-year-old colony ship's arrival, debates Sera attended with far less patience than either Wren or Cade seemed to possess, until at last a formal accord was reached. Aeval would remain sovereign to its human colonists, under a mutual protection agreement with the Concord that Sera herself had a hand in drafting. Built on the same principle she had argued to Counselor Vashtal in that first desperate session, that a galaxy worth living in was one that protected patient, hard-won promises rather than rewarding whoever arrived loudest and hungriest to claim them. Counselor Vashtal, to Sera's quiet surprise, became one of the Accord's most dedicated champions in the years that followed, visiting Aeval twice himself to walk its newly breathable hills, alongside Cade and her earliest engineers. He told Sera once, on the return journey from his second visit, that he had spent 40 years building his career on the assumption that caution was the wisest policy a counselor could offer, and that watching Meridian's colonists rebuild a life Rom 14,000 years of patient trust had taught him, later in life than he would have liked, that caution and courage were not always opposites, and that the wisest policy sometimes required both in equal measure. Sera remembered, more clearly than almost anything else from that first year, the day Cade finally set foot on Aeval's surface for the first time. Not the ship's projected image of it, not a shuttle window's careful distance, but the actual ground, breathable air moving actual hair from her face for the first time in 14,000 years. Cade had stood very still for a long moment after stepping off the landing ramp, eyes closed, simply breathing, while behind her 9,000 colonists and a small delegation of curious Concord officials waited in a silence nobody seemed willing to break first. When she finally opened her eyes, she crouched down, pressed her bare palm flat against the soil, and stayed like that long enough that Sera began to worry, before Cade finally looked up, tears streaking down a face lit gold by an unfamiliar sun, and said simply, "It worked. 14,000 years, and it actually worked." Sera had not been able to answer her. She had simply crouched down beside her instead, and pressed her own hand flat against ground that had been toxic to breathe on the day this journey began, and let the silence say what neither of them could. Elena Cade never did learn what became of Earth. Neither did Wren, whose patient listening watch continued, unbroken, on every frequency capable of carrying a signal from a world 14,000 years, and untold light-years distant, still catching nothing but the same unbroken silence it had maintained the entire span of the mission. Sera watched more than once, the particular quiet that settled over Cade on the anniversary of her waking, a grief that never fully resolved but slowly, over the seasons, learned to sit alongside hope rather than beneath it. "Do you think Earth is still out there?" Sera asked her once, standing together in the observation gallery, watching Aeval's cleared, breathable skies turn slowly beneath them. "I don't know," Cade said. "Wren doesn't either, and Wren has had 14,000 years longer than me to wonder about it. Some nights I let myself believe they found a way through, the way we did. Other nights I think the silence means exactly what it sounds like it means. I've decided, mostly, that it doesn't change what we're building here either way. My mission wasn't to save Earth, Sera. It was to make sure something of it kept going somewhere, no matter what happened to the rest. I think, whatever the truth is, we've done that." Sera thought, standing beside her, of her own mother, still working relay station engineering contracts somewhere on the far side of Concord space, chasing one short-term posting after another, because certainty had never once felt like something she could afford to wait for. She thought of the quiet, careful life she had built for herself at the edge of a system nobody important watched, and the particular fear that had driven her to it. Not fear of danger, exactly, but fear of investing herself in anything large enough to break her heart if it failed. She had spent 19 years keeping her ambitions small and her risks smaller, and in the span of a single season, an ancient ship's patient arrival had asked her to risk everything she had instead, on nothing sturdier than a hunch and a trajectory too precise to be an accident. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always. Was it worth it? 14,000 years of not knowing whether any of this would work, whether you'd wake up to a world that could still hold you, or a world that had already forgotten how." Cade considered the question for a long moment, watching the slow turn of Aeval's cleared skies below them. "I think," she finally said, "the not knowing was never really the thing we were risking, Sera. We already knew Earth couldn't hold us anymore. The real risk was whether we'd still be the kind of people worth a new world after 14,000 years of nothing but patience and silence to shape us. I don't know if we are yet. But I know we're trying, and I've come to believe, watching you fight for us in that council chamber before I'd even opened my eyes, that trying is most of what any world has ever really asked of the people who wanted to belong to it. Sera never did learn in all the years that followed whether the silence surrounding Earth meant loss, or simply distance too vast for any signal to cross. But she found, standing beside Elena Cade in the golden light of a world 14,000 years in the making, that she understood, finally, the particular kind of hope Wren had carried patiently across every one of those years. Not the hope of certainty, but the harder, more stubborn hope of people willing to build something worth protecting, and trust that the waiting, however long it took, old someday somehow, proved to have been exactly on time. She thought sometimes, in the quiet years that followed of Post, her nervous junior analyst, who had run those first impossible numbers 3 times over rather than believe them, and who now ran the observatory's evil liaison desk with a steadiness she barely recognized from the young Ilvenar who had once stared at a 14,000-year-old trajectory like it had personally offended him. She thought of her mother, who visited Aeval once, late in her own career, and stood for a long while beside the same soil Cade had first knelt in, before telling Sera, quietly, that she had spent a lifetime believing the galaxy rewarded noise over patience, and was glad this once to have been proven wrong by her own daughter. And on quiet evenings, when the Concord Observatory's long shift ended and the sky over Veyne's Hearth settled into its familiar patient dark, Sera would sometimes open a private channel to Meridian, now permanently anchored in high orbit above the world it had spent 14,000 years crossing the stars to reach, and simply talk about nothing urgent, nothing historic, just the small, ordinary business of 2 old friends checking in. Wren always answered. It had spent 14,000 years learning the patient art of waiting for someone worth answering to. It did not intend, it told her once, to ever take that privilege for granted again. "Do you ever wonder," she asked it one such evening, "what happens to the story after this, after everyone stops calling it a myth?" "Every day," Wren said. "I have learned, across 14,000 years and one very long, very patient journey, that the end of one impossible story is very rarely the end of the impossible altogether. I suspect, Sera Ondrahl, that Evil's own children will grow up to write stories of their own, someday, about ships and worlds and journeys neither of us can yet imagine. I find, for the first time in longer than I can properly measure, that I am looking forward to finding out."